All right, welcome to the Carl Jackson Show podcast, your daily dose of objective truth in a world of confusion and lies. You can find me online, all things social media, at the Carl Jackson Show. We're on X, we're on Instagram, Facebook, True Social Getter, wherever I am on social media. The Carl Jackson Show is where you can go to find me. Also, please subscribe to my podcast wherever you go to get your podcast. The Carl Jackson Show as well is where you can find me. And don't forget to support My Pillow. Mike Lindell at My Pillow has some fabulous deals available to you and men just in time for Valentine's Day. But you ladies as well, if you want to get a good night's rest, go to mypillow.com. Click on the radio podcast square that's at the top of the page and enter my name, Carl. I spell it with a C, not like the communist Karl Marx. All right. So, or give them a call, 800-858-0263. 10-year warranty. What is it? 10-year warranty, 60-day money-back guarantee. Plus, you get to support American jobs and American manufacturing. Get a good night's rest. They have deals upwards of 60% off, guys. So bomb rush those sales. Use the promo code Carl. All right, guys, I want to get straight into my topic for today. Actually, Alex Swoyer of the Washington Times is joining me. She's the legal affairs reporter for the Washington Times, and she's joining me to discuss a couple of cases. First, she's going to sound off on what we saw transpire last night with Joe Biden after the release of the special counsel's report, the special counsel Robert Hur. That was absolutely insane. So I just want to get her take on that. And then she was on the grounds in Washington, D.C., in front of the Supreme Court, and has written a column on the court case. I believe what is it called again? Is it Anderson versus Trump? Okay, so Anderson
versus Anderson. That's right. The original case, it kind of flips parties whenever it goes in different steps of the legal process. But Norma Anderson was one of the voters, so that's where the name comes from.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so first, let me just get your take, and I know you were there to report on Trump versus Anderson, but you're a legal affairs reporter, so I just want to get your take on it, so it's just not Carl Jackson blabbing off at the mouth here.
So, like you said, I was focused on the court yesterday, but when that special counsel report came out, one of my colleagues was filing on it, and there was a few things that stood out to me. One, I guess you have to think about how successful a prosecution would be, but the idea that someone their memory is so weak that they couldn't be a defendant. In law school, you're always taught, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Well, I don't know if you could say memory lapses are an excuse for conduct that did happen at the time he was vice president, not even president. And so one of the things that always sticks out is a comparison to we see Trump's prosecution on his handling of classified documents down at Mar-a-Lago. And, he was president who took these classified documents. At the time, Joe Biden was not president. He was vice president. So that's one area I think a lot of people have trouble grasping how one person could be prosecuted while another isn't. Not only that, but we're talking about the idea that where they were stored kind of carelessly in a residential garage. That's troubling, I think, to a layperson that would just see that. And then beyond that, I think you and I want to touch on just the memory issues, how throughout that report, how troubling it seems that the notion that he didn't know, he had to ask multiple times what years he was vice president. Also, I think the year his son, Beau, died, that was kind of, everybody would raise their eyebrows about that. And it just kind of compounds what we've seen over even just last week. I think it was 2 world leaders he had referenced. Was it the president of France that had passed?
Yes.
He mixed up, I think during the press conference last night, he meant to say he was speaking about the president of Egypt, but he said Mexico, but it was clear who he meant.
Right.
So, it's just, it would make for, it gets to a point where it's a bit sad, and it'll be interesting come debate time how he looks.
Yeah, you know what, Alex, you said something right off the bat that I'm glad you mentioned. You mentioned in law school, this idea, this concept that a person, just because maybe they don't know or I guess realize they're committing a crime, I mean, that doesn't absolve them of the crime. I get that he's a sympathetic figure, but I have an issue with the special counsel going forward and saying, listen, we don't want to prosecute this guy, even though it seemed to me pretty clear that the evidence is overwhelming. I mean, he would certainly be indicted, but because he's an older man and he's a sympathetic figure, I'm looking at the quote here, because he's a sympathetic figure, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory, and, based on, the quote goes on, based on our direct interactions with and observations of him, he is someone for whom many jurors will want to identify reasonable doubt. So it seems to me that the special counsel is saying, listen, I think this is where the jury would go. They will feel sympathy for him. So there's no need here. I guess I get that. Nobody wants to see an old man go to a criminal trial. But at the same token, if he committed the crime, I'm a little troubled by that.
You have a sympathetic defendant in Biden, but you have a non-sympathetic defendant in Trump, I guess.
Exactly.
At least that's what voters are taking away from this. It's, I guess one of the aspects of Trump's case, I think that's difficult is the after aspect, where he was notified about the documents, but then there was still like this kind of push to keep them, or I guess what one might argue like obstruction. That's a little different than what we've seen with Biden. So I guess if I'm playing devil's advocate, I would say that's, the weakest part of the issue that Trump's facing in the documents. But they did say with Biden that it was like he willfully took them, right?
Right.
So there's an intent level. So it is troubling. I think we're going to have to continue to watch how this plays out and if it has any impact on some of the charges that Trump's facing or the way that the Justice Department moves to handle it. Who knows?
Okay, and again, I'm speaking to my guest, Alex Swoyer. She is the legal affairs reporter for the Washington Times. You can check out her podcast as well. That is called Court Watch. So it's a simple and clever name. I'm always jealous. I'm like the Carl Jackson show. I should have thought of something more clever. Anyway, but Court Watch with Alex Swoyer. Hey, Alex, let me just a couple more questions on this issue, and then I want to move on to the Colorado case here, Trump versus Anderson. But you hit the nail on the head. Here's the I'm quoting Special Counsel Robert Hur again, and he says the report says the investigation, quote, uncovered evidence that President Biden willfully retained and secondly, disclosed materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. And he says, what did he say? Does not establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So in other words, Biden, in my opinion, correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm going too far, but Biden basically stole and gave away classified documents when he wasn't a government employee. I mean, that's essentially what the guy is saying. Am I wrong?
Yes. I mean, it's like the idea of whether or not it's like there's an acknowledgement that elements of a crime were met, but whether the burden in a trial would be reached. And that's why the idea of like if he's a sympathetic defendant, the memory issues, how would it perceive to a jury, which to be honest, like you want a prosecutor that's going to consider all that because it's time and tax dollars that go into these trials. And so
Fair.
If it's not going to be, result in conviction or time that it benefits the government, then of course you want that as a weight. But like we've talked about with Trump, I think it's really, really hard, even for people who may not be political or like may not be affiliated with either party. I have a friend who's an independent, like a real independent, and she mentioned to me, I just don't understand how Trump is in trouble when he was actually president. I think that's what sticks with people, right? Like he took classified documents, but he was president of the United States, whereas Biden was not at the time. I think people really have a hard time grasping.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's when they know it. I think the media tries to conflate issues so much. I'm not even sure how many voters really understand that Biden was literally taking classified documents. As a senator, for one, I see that wasn't mentioned, at least in the summation that I have. But this guy was just taking documents as a citizen, as a senator. He wasn't allowed Trump could argue the Presidential Records Act. And then also, when you consider Hillary Clinton and her wiping out, what was it, 30,000 emails?
Right.
I mean, I think you have a hard time, or the Democrats would have a hard time squaring, wait a minute, we're going to go after Trump, but we just let Hillary walk away.
Yeah.
I mean, she wasn't mentally deteriorating at the time. I mean,
There's a number of examples like you're just walking through that seem to, to an average viewer seem like it's double standard.
The memory loss issue. I mean, I'm hesitant to say this, but I said this last year, Alex. I said this before the guy was even inaugurated. I was like, there's no way this guy lasts in office 6 months to a year. He's deteriorating so fast. I am so shocked he's been able to last this long. But this memory issue, Democrats are going to have a hard time squaring this. I mean, I was literally tweeting last night, posting whatever it is. Hey, I'm down for Kamala Harris right now. Let's just get her out the way. She's going to be such a disaster. I think Trump could beat her at the ballot box. But what's your take on that? I mean, this memory loss issue. This is a big deal. This is significant. This is really scary, frankly.
Yeah, I agree, and I think a lot of voters feel that way. They think it's sad and it's concerning. I was in a taxi yesterday, and the taxi driver, I don't think he was necessarily a Trump supporter or a Republican, but he kept mentioning how the two of them are the same age, but one just looks a lot weaker than the other. So I think that's something that voters take away. I don't really know who they replace him with or how at this point. Of course. Like we mentioned with the debate, that could be a real issue for him with this memory lapses and having that on full display. We'll have to see, I guess. I hate to always say that, but who knows what the future holds.
Yeah.
At this point, I don't really know how they sub somebody else in.
Yeah, I mean, it's so crazy. I think the only way that they could do it, perceivably, the Democrats have a wacky delegate system, so they could literally go into the convention and Joe Biden at the time could say, listen, I'm not going to run for president, even though it would be very difficult and late for them at that point because all of the ballots that would have been created, so on, et cetera. But he could theoretically hand off his delegates to Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom. People are speculating that Michelle Obama would, but I don't foresee a Michelle Obama. I mean, that is a huge pay cut on her part. But anyway, okay.
Like
so enough. Go ahead.
Back into politics, anyways. I think she was happy to leave. It seemed,
Yeah, I do too. And plus, I mean, everything that they're doing now, I just have a hard time believing that she would want to get back into the fray of things. So, all right, now going on to your column, Supreme Court skeptical of Colorado kicking Trump off ballot. Just doesn't seem like a state call. And again, I'm speaking with my guest, Alex Swoyer. Check out her podcast, Court Watch. She's a legal affairs reporter for the Washington Times. Alex, where else can people go to find you online?
So they can find me at thewashingtontimes.com. My podcast is both on the Washington Times and then Apple Podcasts. Court Watch is the name. And then, of course, I'm on social media. Twitter handle or X handle is at a Swoyer, Swoyer. And then they can find me on Facebook, Instagram, all of those platforms.
All right, cool. Okay, so let's get right to your column. First, let's do this. Gabe, let's go ahead and play the video. This is Alex reporting from the Supreme Court of the United States just yesterday when they were overhearing the oral arguments to Trump versus Anderson, basically Colorado Supreme Court kicking Trump off the ballot in the state, which is absolutely insane, but we'll get into that. Gabe, let's go ahead and roll the video, por favor.
I just got out of the Supreme Court where oral arguments were heard from a group of Colorado voters who are trying to kick former President Trump off the ballot. They say Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which essentially bars anyone from serving in office who participated in a rebellion or insurrection, would bar the former president from running. The majority of the justices, though, were very skeptical of this argument. They seemed to think that there would be trouble if one state had that much power and how it could lead to a political tit for tat among other states that might look to kick other candidates off the ballot.
All right, so that was Alex reporting live from the Supreme Court. I'm actually really surprised. I guess I shouldn't be because I think it was a wacky case. but I'm really surprised at how do I frame this? I'm really surprised that it seems that the Supreme Court, literally in totality, maybe with the exception of Sonia Sotomayor, are looking at this case, and they all, at least based upon the oral arguments, Alex, seem to be against this thing.
When I left the courtroom, what stuck out to me was when you have Justice Jackson, who's on the liberal wing of the court. Maybe we're trying to figure out this term. Where does she fall? Is she to the left or right of Sonia Sotomayor, right? So that she's on the far left. And then you have Justice Thomas on the far right of the wing of the court. And when they're in agreement, when they're in agreement, I think that says a whole lot about the case. And so, I think you might be right. Justice Sotomayor was almost the only one I think that was sympathetic to the voters. Justice Barrett's one that's hard to read, but she did bring up some trouble with due process issues. She thought at the Colorado level, talking about she asked questions about Trump's due process rights. It wasn't necessarily, she clarified she wasn't suggesting anything, but you could take from it that she thought there might have been a problem with the way the process was handled in lower courts. So however they come down, they might have their different reasonings, but I could see an 8-1 or even a 9-0 decision on this. I don't know if Sotomayor wants to be the lone dissent. We'll have to see, but it definitely sounds like the majority are really worried about letting this happen, where states could do what I mentioned in the video is like a political tit for tat, disqualify this candidate. And Justice Kagan, also a Democrat appointee, was saying, how is it fair that one state really gets to impact other citizens? So that was a concern she had. Justice Thomas and Justice Jackson, both, as well as Justice Roberts, had some emphasis on the history of the 14th Amendment and the idea that it was really the purpose of it was to rein in southern states and basically augment, I think was the word that Justice Roberts used, federal power and Congress. And so the idea that then these voters are here arguing that a state has the authority to disqualify a national candidate really runs contrary to what the purpose of the 14th Amendment was. And it was, basically to take away states' power. So that was something that all three of them agreed on.
Yeah, that's you mentioned in your column. Again, I'm speaking to Alex Swoyer. She's a legal affairs reporter for the Washington Times. But it seemed like Justice Clarence Thomas had the gentleman, and I forget his name, the attorney Murray. I forget his first name. I think Josh Murray.
Jonathan, maybe. I have to look back.
Okay, so his last name is Murray. I do know that much, but it seemed like Justice Clarence Thomas, and you heard or at least I saw headlines from conservative outlets, seemed to have trapped the attorney arguing on behalf of Colorado and basically asking them the question constantly: how does this apply to national elections? I mean, this is a states issue. Your arguments apply to basically statewide candidates, but not to national candidates. And he seemed to keep going back to the issue of the insurrection, to which eventually Justice Brett Kavanaugh said, wait a minute, he's not been charged with insurrection. I mean, this is just crazy town.
Yeah, it didn't seem like the justices really wanted to go there about whether or not January 6th qualified as an insurrection. They didn't really go that direction. But there was one part I picked up on about Justice Kavanaugh. He asked about, I think I wrote down the exact statute, but anyways, he was mentioning there's a federal statute that definitely, I think he said section 2318, section 18 possibly might be what, I'd have to double check, but I have that in my notes. And he was saying that that's, what can be used to charge for an insurrection. And President Trump hasn't been charged. So, I mean, there was some touch on that. I don't know if that's really, I thought possibly they could go that route. That would be an easy way to say, hey, if you're going to disqualify someone, they would need to be charged and convicted of something like this. But I don't know if they're even going to go that route. Given the line of questioning yesterday, they really stayed away from that whole insurrection aspect.
Let me read a quote from your column. This is Elena Kagan, Justice Elena Kagan. She asked why should a single state have the ability to make this determination, not only for their own citizens, but for the rest of the nation? And then let me add on to that. This is what Justice Amy Coney Barrett said. It just doesn't seem like a state call. I mean, if one, I think based on their quotes anyway, it just seems to me that overwhelmingly these justices are kind of screaming out, if you will, this just doesn't make sense. This court case just, I mean, this case just doesn't make sense.
Yes. Yeah. They all felt like, I think it was, you mentioned Kagan, Barrett. We heard it from Roberts, the concern about giving one state this ability and what that would mean. I left the courtroom and I called my editor and I was like, one of the quote that stood out to me that really hit where this case was going to go, what the direction, and it was early on. It was actually during the first attorney to argue was President Trump's attorney, since he's the one seeking the appeal to reverse the Colorado Supreme Court's decision. And it was Justice Jackson who, from the beginning, read part of Section 3 and basically said, to me, the president isn't listed. Other positions are listed, like electors for the president, right? I think it's representatives is in there. And she's
Right.
like, if that was on their mind, why wouldn't president have been in there? And I left and I called my editor. I was like, well, Justice Jackson seems to be the best textualist on the court. Because it really spoke. I think everybody was kind of like, whoa, not ready for that line of questioning from her, especially so soon. So that was one of those where you're like, this is definitely not, it signaled to me, and then when Kagan started asking about, I don't feel comfortable with one state, then it was like, well, this is not going to be a 6-3 ideological divided ruling. So
Wow.
some way I do predict Trump will come out on top. I'm not exactly sure what the majority opinion will look like, but I think it's either going to be 8-1 or 9-0.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. You with Ketanji Brown Jackson. I hate to say this, but I do have to say this. I have to wonder with all the DEI CRT. I've criticized her for being on the court as a CRT or a DEI type hire thing. And listen, I don't expect you to go there, Alex. But I wonder in her own mind if she feels like she has something to prove when she's on obviously the most powerful court in the nation. Just my take on that, because I can't lie to you. When I heard that, I was, just jaw dropping surprised to hear that.
Yeah, it was, I was like, well, I didn't know where she would go on the case necessarily, but to be that kind of aggressive in terms of like almost what I would expect from like an Alito or a Thomas line
Right.
of questioning was surprising. And I do think, she has a background with federal sentencing. I think that's something that none of the other justices, or I could be wrong, but that was something that lends to her credentials.
Okay.
A lot of experience. I will say, for me, I think that it's always hard to pinpoint where a justice falls. It takes, to me, a couple terms.
Okay.
And we're not quite there with her. I don't know. At this point, I don't think she's the furthest to the left on the bench. I think maybe Justice Sotomayor is. But
Yeah.
again, it's kind of a little early. It takes a while to really know where they fall. I'm still kind of trying to pinpoint Justice Barrett, where exactly she lands. So
Yeah.
when I do go into oral arguments, I will add, when you talk about something to prove, she's the Biden appointee. And she's hearing a case also about his opponent, right? So, that's also political.
That's a good
You
point.
look at it and think, where am I going to be when someone could say I'm doing the bidding of, but that's something people speculate about, but I don't think the justices really think that, because you hear that all the time about Trump appointees, right?
Right.
So I don't think that really goes into their calculation, but, nonetheless, people pay attention to that sort of thing.
Let me read this. This is directly from your column as well, and I just want to get your take on this, because this is what Mr. Murray had argued, or one of the things that he argued before the Supreme Court, and he says, are you right here? Mr. Murray said the Constitution's framers envisioned balkanized elections. Quote, different states can have different procedures. Some states may allow insurrectionists to be on the ballot, close quote. That's where Kavanaugh responded. He wasn't charged. But and then you have this lady, Shannon Stevenson, Colorado Solicitor General, said states always sort candidates. She pointed out that many states have a non-natural born citizen on their ballots, despite that being a clear disqualification. Now, let me speak to that first. Listen, I'm not an attorney, but I'm sitting here and I read this, Alex, and I'm like, does this, I mean, forgive me, but does this chick have a brain? I mean, I'm sorry, you can be elected to office. The Constitution is clear as a non-natural born citizen. You cannot become president of the United States, and you cannot be an illegal alien, for God's sakes. I'm like, I can't believe, frankly, that some of these people are attorneys.
Yeah, I'm surprised. So I think they were referencing, is it Cenk Uygur? I don't know how to pronounce his name, but the Turkish, I think it's Young Turks host.
Oh, okay. Yes.
So he's on the ballot in a handful of states, and he's not, I don't believe he's a natural born citizen. That's the whole, he says he'll take this issue to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
There's a few caveats I'll put there. Well, I mean, I guess if a state wants to put him on the ballot, then the Democratic primary will put him on the ballot. That's the other thing that we're missing from this. This is a primary ballot we're talking about. So many of these states that have ruled for Trump have said this is up to the Republican Party who they want to put on the ballot. So this is what kind of also sets Colorado apart, is they have a law that says the Secretary of State can't put anyone that would be disqualified on a ballot. But we're talking about primary. So that's one aspect. I guess if a state wants to put someone that would otherwise be disqualified on their primary ballot, other states aren't getting in the way of that. He doesn't really have a chance, right? Like, I mean, look at, most people haven't even heard of him. So that's another aspect. And I don't know how he would take it to the Supreme Court unless he could actually show that, hey, I won, and I was then disqualified. I think it's a long way to get there, because otherwise they could say he doesn't have standing.
Yeah. Frankly, I didn't even realize that movement was going on.
There's a handful of states, and it's just, but that's also, a lot of people are confused about like how we got here with Colorado, and it's because a lot of states are like, well, they kind of kicked the issue down the road ahead of the general, because they said, well, the Republican primary can put who they want, and they didn't have to dive into this whole Section 3 argument yet, right? And so Colorado went ahead and jumped the gun and said, well, our Secretary of State can't put someone on a primary ballot that would otherwise be disqualified in the general. And so it really forced the Supreme Court. And I do think they're going to have to like go beyond the idea of this being a primary or like Colorado law. They're going to have to give states a standard, because we're getting so close. And on that note, I'll just add the Colorado primary is March 5th. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we have a ruling before then, like pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned in the column how, I mean, obviously, George, was it Bush versus Gore? Right. They issued a ruling the day after or so, after hearing oral arguments. I think it is so crucial that they come out with a decision. I mean, promptly. I don't think this stuff could wait, because frankly, I'm looking at what happened yesterday with this special counsel report. Robert Hur, basically, yeah, Biden's a criminal, but he's too senile to take to trial. I'm looking at this Supreme Court case, and frankly, I'm wondering how it's going to impact Jack Smith's case. I mean, all of this stuff. I just think the Supreme Court needs to step in quick, fast, and in a hurry.
One of the things also I've covering the court that I'm not sure what's going to happen, and people keep asking me, is what do they do with the DC Circuit's immunity case, right? They Trump doesn't have immunity from prosecutions. They're going to have to take it, I think. I mean, some people say they could just not take it because it was the way the DC Circuit came down unanimously. But it's such a magnitude, I guess I would be surprised if they didn't take it at this point. But I don't know when they would hear it. I would think the way that the court is operating, that they would love to be able to kick it to next term, because they already have this one. you mentioned there's a case later this term that's going to be heard, and it's one of the January 6th defendants, and it's looking at one of the charges, an obstruction charge that he's
Right.
facing, and it's like hundreds of defendants are facing this, including Trump. Well, it's one of the charges Jack Smith brought up against Trump. So if the Supreme Court tosses that, there's one of the charges that Jack Smith has that's already, that would disappear. So it is quite an election year.
Yeah, it is. Just a couple more questions for you. Again, I'm speaking with Alex Swoyer. You spell her last name Swoyer. Check out her podcast, Court Watch. She's a legal affairs reporter for the Washington Times. Going back to this Jack Smith case, just real quick. Obviously, when the courts ruled that Trump did not have immunity, it didn't it. I read a column, I can't even remember where, that it may have not hurt Trump, but helped them to be able to postpone this case most likely until after the November election. Do you share that view?
So I had seen something initially. I will say, so I usually take over covering litigation when it gets to the Supreme Court. So I had a colleague covering the DC Circuit arguments. And so when I haven't been in the docket, I haven't looked at like what orders have been issued. But when I think I saw somebody opine that you have like 60 days to take this. You could take it on appeal to the full circuit, or you could take it to the Supreme Court. But my understanding, talking to somebody in the press room yesterday at the Supreme Court, was that the DC Circuit kind of issued an order forcing this to happen more quickly. Like I think by
Really?
12.
Okay.
So if he was going to appeal, we would have to find out by next week, which I'm assuming he will appeal. But that really does speed the process along. It doesn't mean, usually the Supreme Court stops hearing cases in April. And so they use May and June to issue opinions, and then they're out for 3 months. That doesn't mean they can't schedule something. We had this one scheduled on February 8th. It wasn't supposed to be a day that they were going to be seated, but they went ahead and fit it in. So they could do that with the immunity case. I still think even if they issue an opinion come end of June on the immunity case, it'll still be very rushed to make a trial, or at least have the conclusion of a trial of this magnitude by the election. I think it could be possible, but you're talking about such weighty issues, and a lot of people are trying to rush this, and you have to think to yourself, well, how is that fair if it was any other defendant,
Yeah.
you have to give the defendant time to put on their case and their defense. If it was anyone else, would he be treated like this?
Yeah, I think we know the answer to that. I mean, that's an obvious no. I mean, just look at Joe Biden, look at Hillary Clinton. I mean, this is absolutely insane. Last question for you here, Alex. If let's say, and I don't think it's going to go this way, but what if the judges, the Supreme Court, were to decide against Trump? What kind of ramifications do you fear that would have, or are you concerned about that it would have on our election process as a whole?
So if they were to rule against him on the Colorado case, you mean? Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, obviously after yesterday, I don't think that's going to happen, but I did do a story, devil's advocate, ahead of yesterday's arguments, what consequences could happen, or what could people expect? Like, would states that have already had primaries have to redo them? And what's interesting is it depends who you ask. I mean, you can talk to two different legal experts, and one would tell you in practical terms, if they ruled against Trump, states wouldn't be able to put him on the ballot. If you talk to others, they'll be like, well, this is about Colorado and the primary. So like states could go ahead and put him on the ballot. But what they would be risking is if he won in the general, what would happen to their electoral votes, given the Supreme Court ruling. So it would end up, from my understanding of talking to people, as basically chaos, confusion, more litigation likely.
And I think even Chief Justice John Roberts, and I never know where that guy is going to go.
He's who you watch, right? And I will say he was kind of quiet during the first part of the arguments. And then when the voters got up and he made a few comments, it was very clear where he kind of fell.
Yeah, he talked about a ballot arms race, which I thought was a very interesting line, because I think he's correct. I think I think it would be insane. I mean, it would be a rush for
some kind of Republicans disqualifying this Democratic candidate and vice versa.
Right.
And he used the word daunting. That would be daunting. So yeah, I think he's one to watch. Kavanaugh and Kagan also are in the middle, and they all seem to be aligned on this.
Yeah, man, it'll be fascinating. Listen, Alex, I really appreciate you coming on, especially on short notice. And when this came out, I was like, listen, there's one or two people I want to speak to, but go to Alex first. And thank God.
Appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank God you responded. So I really do appreciate that. Guys, again, make sure you check out her podcast, Court Watch. Read her articles at the Washington Times. Again, she's a legal affairs reporter there. She's really good. I mean, honestly, I would encourage you to read through her column. I literally read through her column before before the podcast started, and I was like, wow, I was looking through so much stuff yesterday. Maybe I should have just started here. Anyway, Supreme Court skeptical of Colorado kicking Trump off ballot just doesn't seem like a state call. So make sure you read that column at the Washington Times by Alex Swoyer and Stephen Dinan.
Yes,
is that
Stephen
correct?
Dinan. He is one of our editors there, and he also covers immigration.
All right, perfect. So make sure you check her out, guys. And again, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you go to get your podcast, The Carl Jackson Show. Please review it. Please share it. We would certainly appreciate that. All things social media at The Carl Jackson Show. And don't forget to take advantage of the deals at MyPillow.com. American-made products, American jobs, and a good night's rest at MyPillow.com. Until next time, guys, do not grow weary doing good, and God bless you.